Hello and welcome to RFree 101, the basics of choosing a frequency. This is assuming you have more than one choice. This is going to cover the technical reasons why you might choose a frequency and not the strategic ones. My name is Paul. I work at the Prometheus Radio Project. I'm the developer of RFree, the software we're about to use. And if you haven't seen the RFree Quick Start video and you're completely unfamiliar with RFree, I suggest maybe you'd like to start with the Quick Start video. I'm going to jump right in, and we're going to use the same search, the same location that we did for the RFree Quick Start video. We're going to use, I'm going to give it a name, RFree 101, since that's what this is about. These question marks explain all kinds of things. If you need to click on those to get a pop-up, you can. And I know that the library at Farmington, New Mexico will get me pretty close. I need to click on the magnifying glass to get the map repositioned. There I am in Farmington. I'm going to zoom in because I know where I want to put it on the library. I want to put it right there. I could also look at the satellite view. Yep, that looks about right to me. So that's where I'm going to put it. So I'm going to ask RFree to check whether there are frequencies available at this location. If you saw the Quick Start video, this should produce the same results as we saw in the Quick Start. RFree is checking to see of the stations that are nearby, is this location spaced far enough from them that it wouldn't interfere with listeners to those stations if you put a station here. So the antenna location was saved. Let me review what's on this page before we go any further. Up here at the top are a series of menus and actions. They're not all menus. They're in order. First we select a location. We just did that. Usually then the next thing is to choose a frequency. But before you choose one, you need to know which ones are available. The frequencies available page, which is the page we're on, is how you do that. Then after you have a frequency, or actually you can do it before you have a frequency, you might want to visit the elevation of your antenna, or the elevation of your site and the height of your antenna. We'll go into that briefly. Then there are some review items, including an image of what your paperwork at the FCC might look like. Over here on the left is what I call the postage stamp. There's some basic information about this station, its name, the fact that RFree is doing calculations as though this was a 100 watt powered station with an antenna 30 meters above average terrain. That's not above the ground, that's above average terrain, which is a complex idea that I'm not going to get into. But RFree consulted some terrain databases and determined that to get 30 meters above average terrain, you need your height at 102 meters. That's too tall. We're going to change that. Longitude and latitude. This is a map. If you want to, you can change it. Though RFree won't remember what it's set at from time to time. But this is just so that you know where you are, what is your context of this antenna location search that you're looking at. Now let's go over to the frequencies available table. It's got 3 columns. The frequencies at this location, there's one frequency that's labeled with this green check mark. The actual frequency associated with that green check mark is 103.5. And the clearest signal distance, which I'll explain in a second, for 103.5 is 7.1 kilometers. Let's look down again to these yellow ones. Yellow frequencies might be available, they might not be available. You click on this yellow question mark, you can find out more about that. There are 13 of these. The way we read this is that 92.5 has a clearest signal distance of 13.3 kilometers. Clearest signal distance. You can click the question mark to find out more. What it means is for 103.5, to choose an example, listeners 7.1 kilometers from your antenna might begin to experience interference from other radio stations. Now, they might begin to experience interference. It probably won't be very bad. They'll probably still be able to hear your station. But if you're going to be choosing between different frequencies available, you generally want the biggest, clearest signal distance. Now you don't have to go crazy here. The normal listening distance for an LPFM is 5.6 kilometers or less. So if this is 5.6 kilometers or more, or even 5 kilometers maybe, 7.1 kilometers is more than 5.6 kilometers. That's fine. What I'm saying is there's not a big difference in relevance choosing the 13 kilometers over the 7 kilometers because you're not going to have any listeners at 13 kilometers anyway most of the time. So anything over 5 or 6 kilometers is probably quite acceptable. Now here's one that's only 3.1 kilometers at 94.5. 3.1 kilometers is pretty small, but if you're covering a small town or a neighborhood in a small town, it might be far enough. So check that out. It doesn't always need to be the biggest number. It just needs to be big enough for your situation. Now, other information about these frequencies on this page, this number that we've been sort of skipping over, this PZ number. For yellow frequencies which are coded yellow may be available. What that means is to file an application for 92.5, you're going to have to make an argument to the FCC why 92.5 at this location isn't going to interfere with other listeners of other radio stations. The whole thing about the rules is you're not allowed to interfere with listeners to other radio stations. At 92.5, in order to not interfere with listeners to other radio stations, you need to make sure that no listeners to them are within a zone, the prohibited zone, or PZ, the prohibited zone, in this case, 304 meters. 304 meters from what? That's 304 meters from your antenna in every direction. It's like a huge sphere. It's a beach ball, 304 meters in radius. Now that's pretty big. That's like a quarter of a mile probably. In many areas of the country, you're not going to find an area a quarter mile in radius, a circle on the ground, for example, a quarter mile in radius, that'd be a half a mile across, with no population in it. Okay, so this is maybe not going to be very feasible, this 92.5. That's why it says they may be available. Now it might be that you can put this in the middle of a huge cemetery or a huge wildlife refuge or some other place where you can make an argument that there won't be any population. But generally 304 meters is going to be a difficult frequency to make that argument for, simply because of the population density in the US. I need to say before we move on that if you are stuck, and in some urban areas in particular, you're going to be using some of these numbers that are too big, these prohibited zones that are quite difficult to deal with, you can contact an engineer, an expert engineer in this work, and they can set you up with special antennas that are going to cost more money, but they will dramatically reduce the prohibited zone. In this case, possibly to, for example, 60 meters or 1/5 of what it is right now. Now, that's going to vary considerably based on the different circumstances and different locations. You need to talk to an engineer. The engineer will also need to fill out a highly technical exhibit which gets added to your application to the FCC that explains why it's okay to let you apply for, in this case, 92.5. In general, if something is coded yellow, you're going to need an expert to at least understand and often to file extra information with your application to the FCC. I'll usually say you need an engineer, but some of this stuff isn't terribly complicated and you could do it yourself if you're technically expert yourself. So if we're going to evaluate these frequencies, and that's what RFree 101 is about, we would first take a look at this clear signal distance. You can see they're all over the place, but there are many over here. 7.1, that's pretty good. 5 isn't too bad. 8.6, 11, these are pretty big numbers. Here's a 5. So first you'd look at the clearest signal distances. Now, once you're looking into the yellow frequencies, you also need to look at the prohibited zones. And 304 meters, like I said, is probably too large, though it can be shrunk with the proper engineering and the more expensive antennas. Here's a prohibited zone of only 7 meters on 94.5. 7 meters is not much. Let's say, for example, we're going to mount that antenna on a 30-foot pole on top of the library. Well, 30 feet is more than 7 meters. That means that if you envision a beach ball 7 meters in radius, 30 feet up, it's not even going to touch the roof. This turns out to be a pretty easy argument to make to the FCC. The engineering for this is fairly straightforward. So generally, all other things being equal, if you're choosing among yellow frequencies, you want to choose the ones with the lower prohibited zone numbers. Now here in Farmington, 97.3 has 45 meters, as does 103.3, 45 meters. 45 meters is still a big number. That's not going to work on the 30-foot pole. A 30-foot pole is, what's that, 10 meters? 9 to 10 meters. So 45 meters isn't going to work. However, if you had the resources to do so, you could consult an engineer and get this 45 meters taken down to perhaps a fifth of that. So if you still wanted to use 103.3. The reason I'm talking about this, clearly these numbers are not necessary in Farmington. You could go for the 94.5 with 7 meters. That'd be relatively straightforward. However, the clearest signal distance is 3.1 kilometers. That's not very large, but it might be large enough for you. If your listeners are all within 3.1 kilometers of your antenna, this is still a good choice for you. Choose the one that fits in your situation, remembering that your signal isn't going to go much further than 5.6 kilometers anyway. Actually, it will, but you're going to need better radios to receive it out further than that. A lot of cases that we see in urban areas, people are going to have to deal with prohibited zones more than 7 meters. So 45 meters is a not atypical situation that's going to happen in a lot of more populated areas. Now, when you're ready to look at one of these, and let's look at 103.3 as an example. Why 103.3? Well, let's pretend we're in an urban area and we don't have this nice 7-meter one, or we don't like this 3.1 meters. Maybe we want to skip the easy one at 103.5 because we think there's going to be competition there, so we're going to pick a harder one. So let's pick this 103.3. It also has a pretty decent clear signal distance here of 6.1 kilometers. So to look further at a frequency that you're choosing, you click on it and you come to the frequency details page. This is the frequency details page, details for 103.3. There's a lot of information here. It tells you what your next steps might be, and you can read that. Here is a table that gives you the situation. It has 3 columns. What is the nearby station, which you need to know something about? Where is it relative to you? And is it too close? Now you can read these things to find out more information, but let's just read through it. KAZX at 102.9 megahertz is 26 kilometers, roughly northeast, and it is too close. It's too close by 57 kilometers. This is why it's yellow. It's coded yellow because it is too close, but it's too close in such a way that the FCC has given the parameters of the arguments we can make to say, well, if you can prove there's no interference to other listeners to other radio stations, you can get this. Remember, the prohibited zone here was 45 meters. This KAZX is the reason for that, and you can't see that detail on this page. That's something to show on the advanced RFree videos. If you want to know more about KAZX, I strongly recommend that you use these links below. They say more from the FCC or REC Networks or the Cavill Mertz and Associates. REC Networks, I'll just click on that so you can see what I mean. Here's a lot more information about KAZX. It's in Kirtland, New Mexico. Here's a map. There's all kinds of information, technical information, ownership information, what they've been doing to the station over the years. This is really a lot of information, and if this was a station that you needed to worry about, you'd really need to be seeing this information. You only need to worry about it to the extent of getting the waiver, so I don't think you'll need to be looking into this. But if you need more information, when you need more information about other stations, I strongly recommend you use these links. You can also click on the station name itself, and you'll get more information from RFree, but RFree's information is not nearly so thorough or user-friendly. But the one thing you do get from RFree is you get the listener area, or what's called the service contour. These next three stations are coded green check marks. Why? Because they're far enough away. That's all there is to it. You can look here to see, this one's 62 kilometers. It's roughly northeast as well. It's in Durango. It's at 103.3 megahertz. These are just the first three that show up on the list as being the ones closest to giving you some problems. Now, the next thing that I recommend doing is, when you're considering 103.3, is to look at the frequency map. Now, the frequency map shows where else could you put your antenna. This isn't actually a very good example, but it shows where else could you put your antenna and not run into trouble. It's not unusual for stations to move their antenna over the years, or even right away. Leases change, costs change, somebody gets a house that you can put an antenna in the backyard, things like that happen. So this map, the frequency map, shows where you could relocate and have the same situation. What it shows in this case is that the prohibited areas are in red, and you can turn that on and off. There's a prohibited area up in the upper right corner of this map. That means that if we moved this up into here, that would be prohibited. So of course we wouldn't do that. And we're just going to cancel out of this in a second. The areas that require waivers from the FCC, that's permission to not be matching the most stringent of the spacing requirements, are shown in yellow. Now, this is a typical situation where you can't tell, is this yellow or is it the natural color of the map? So it's often handy to turn this on and off. And you can see that this is yellow all over the map. And if we zoom out, you'll see that it's a circle around some radio station over here. So we can see that we could relocate this station quite a distance and still apply for this frequency. What I mean, still apply. That also means that, for example, people in Aztec and people in Kirtland could also apply for this frequency. So this is something to think about strategically as well. If you have a frequency that may be Kirtland, if you're expecting a lot of competition in Kirtland, and you had a frequency that wasn't available to be applied for in Kirtland, that might be a reason to prefer it. So now that we've looked at 103.3, let's select that. And RFree is going to recheck just to make sure everything's okay. We have one more step before we're finished with this, as far as we're going to go in the RFree 100 series, which is the non-expert series. And you see the situation is the same. So this KAZX is coded yellow, so we're going to need an expert to deal with that. We're almost to the point where we're going to probably hand it off to that expert, but the next thing we want to do, 1, 2, 3, elevation and height. Elevation and height, a lot of information. I suggest you read it. RFree consulted some terrain databases and learned that to get 30 meters above average terrain, the antenna at this location needed to be 102 meters. Now, I can't build a 102 meter antenna on top of the library. I'm going to put it up on a 30-foot pole on top of the library, and I'm going to say that that gets me to 18 meters. I don't know if it does or not. So I put in the 18 meters, I hit OK. 18 meters shows up in this list. There's a lot of other information in this about other heights. This is the height above average terrain. For example, here's the one that we are at, 30 meters above average terrain at 100 watts means you have to put the antenna at 102 meters above the ground. And then there's some text that describes what's special about this height. We're now at 18. We're going to save this. And RFree will check it yet again. Everything's okay. Now let's click over to review. I recommend that everybody go through this overview page. This shares some things that might be factors. For example, if there are nearby AM radio stations, you might want to consider a different location, because if the AM station experiences any difficulties or thinks they might, you might be on the hook for some costly tests and or changes. Here are some sites that the FCC protects. They don't want too high of a signal there so that they can do their research or whatever they're doing, monitoring. We're not in the border zone of Mexico or Canada, so there's no information there. So this review overview page, which is the one we're on, is not very interesting. The coverage map is simply the same map that's usually on the left, but it's bigger. This coverage, you'll notice it's now pretty much circular. This is because the antenna is quite low. The FCC coverage predictor math will not deal with heights above average terrain that are less than 30. It says, oh, less than 30, we'll just pretend it's 30. And that's why it thinks it's 30 in all of these directions. It's not. It's somewhat less than 30, but they just default it to 30. That's why this is a circle, and the coverage prediction in this case should be taken with a grain of salt. Now, Farmington is a relatively flat city with geographic features around it that are definitely not flat, so you're probably going to be well served by getting on top of that library and looking from there to see where you can see, because if you can see or nearly see a location from there, it's probably going to get a pretty good radio signal. The next thing in the review is the Form 318 tech box. This is what you would file at the FCC using their online system. The Form 318 is the form you file to apply for an FM, low power FM radio station. We're going to apply for 103.3. This is called Section 6 at the FCC, Technical Specifications, and this looks just like the thing at the FCC. RFree takes care of some things. We're talking about 103.3 megahertz, but the FCC really wants channel numbers. It's, in this case, 277. RFree takes care of that. The FCC wants coordinates in a coordinate system called NAD27. Most of the rest of the world and systems use NAD83. These coordinates are NAD83, for example. Google Map uses NAD83. And you'll notice that they're different. 108.10.52.7, 108.10.50.44. So RFree takes care of converting to NAD27 for you, and you're basically going to copy the information on this form over to your FCC application. However, and this is where the expert is needed, it says here you must prepare Exhibit 11 and you have to check no. I'm not going to get into this, but your expert is going to have to follow these instructions or do some other thing to figure out how to make the argument to the FCC that it's okay for you to apply for 103.3. They're going to have to make the argument that you're not going to cause interference, even though in the strictest spacing sense the FCC says, well, you might. And they're going to do that by constructing something called Exhibit 11 at the FCC. You would click on this box to pop up Exhibit 11, and since this isn't an advanced RFree, I'm not going to go into that, and we're finished with RFree 101. In RFree 102, we're going to talk about how to discover additional frequencies, and we're going to do that for Farmington. Even though there are plenty here, we're going to discover a different frequency for Farmington and see how that works. This is a process that you'll often have to do, or you might want to do, in more congested areas. I'm Paul. Thanks for listening to RFree 101. I hope to see you for RFree 102.